So, welcome to the EU Policy Making Hub. This is a professional development program for policymakers. I'm your host for the Industry 5.0 session. My name is Peter Dröll. I'm in charge of prosperity in the EU's Research and Industry Department, which is organized around the dimensions of sustainability: people, planet, prosperity. The EU Policy Making Hub is part of the European Commission commitment to increase policy making skills and knowledge. It offers over 150 videos on big picture questions of EU policy making. This session on Industry 5.0 is an open session, accessible across the globe. So briefly, some practical tips. You can follow the session either via Slido or through web streaming. Slido has the advantage that you can engage with the speakers and leave also your comments. To access Slido, open your web browser, type Slido, and enter the code EUPMH17. So for EU Policy Making Hub, EUPMH17 with digits. We do not record your comments in Slido. That's about the practical tips for today. Ready to go? So, Industry 5.0. Over the last 2 centuries, we have witnessed several industrial revolutions. And over the last 2 decades, we have seen the digitalization of industry, which is often associated with Industry 4.0. And Industry 4.0 is about efficiency gains, predictive maintenance, machines talking to each other, data, industrial data. Today, we'll dive into a paradigm shift, Industry 5.0. And we will hear firsthand from 2 outstanding policymakers and visionary thinkers. Kirsten Dunlop, she is the CEO of the EIT Climate-KIC. Kirsten has an impressive career in academia, in industry, in banking, insurance and strategy. And she's member of a high-level expert group, ESIR, Economic and Societal Impact of Research and Innovation, and has co-authored this report, Industry 5.0, a transformative vision for Europe. And with Kirsten is Jean Eric Paquet, the Director General of EU Research and Innovation, the one who had anticipated the European Green Deal and organized EU research and innovation around the dimensions of sustainability. And Jean Eric Paquet has taken the responsibility for this report we published a year ago, which started the actions, the thinking on Industry 5.0. So a warm welcome to both of you. And Kirsten, I go straight to the topic on Industry 5.0. The ESIR report, your report, makes a strong case for it. Why do we need Industry 5.0?
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you and with Jean Eric. So first of all, we are in a state of permanent crisis. If we needed any more reminder of that, we now have war. So we need transformation, and indeed the work of the ESIR, the reflections of the ESIR group through 2020 in response to the COVID pandemic, emphasized the fact that Europe needs a triple imperative. One, to protect and shore up our existing structures, our well-being, our way of life, but that opens up a new chapter. Another, to prepare for the way in which we transform and we take ourselves forward and with resilience through ongoing shocks, but also through the opportunity to change and to create more sustainable ways of living. And the last is the reality of transformation, not change in an incremental sense, but really structural differences in our design for life and in our design for the economy. And this paper and the work that the ESIR group has done in response to your work, to the work of Jean Eric, and to the broader thinking that had been emerging, is very much about the power of industry to do something about that. The role of industry playing a pivotal perspective, a really pivotal role in transforming human life, because industry carries human economy. It frames up a sense of identity, of meaning, of purpose, of what one is doing in daylight or night hours. And industry is the superstructure for our current design for life. It is built on economic principles and market principles of extraction, of exploitation, of productivity, and of unequal distributions. And we've seen that actually even more through the pandemic, the massive capturing of wealth and increase of poverty. And we're seeing now even more the crisis of fuel poverty. So we have a sort of a dual thing, and an imperative to transform, an opportunity to do so through industry, and a root cause need to stop servicing success factors, principles, and activities that are built on some of the root causes of our climate challenges and of the collapse of biodiversity. But we also have, and I think that's very clear in the paper, the reality that industry is already progressing. Industry is already quite out far ahead in seeking to go forward. So the Industry 5.0 vision is about creating the guiding principles and the enabling principles for coherence, connecting the industrial effort to transform and anticipate, to embrace digital technologies, but directing that towards outcomes that are sustainable, that are regenerative, that allow us to engage in economic employment, to develop and use resources, to exchange with one another in ways that rebuild our environment, rebuild our societies, and give us a chance for something that is genuinely cohesive, prosperous, and trustful. And I think that's the essence of it. This is a chance for industry to lead a transformation and to connect the dots on a lot of things that people are seeking solutions for.
Thank you, Kirsten. Can I come back to that? Is something wrong with Industry 4.0? Your report is a bit critical about that, or is it just that we are improving and adding a dimension to Industry 4.0?
No, I think this is really naming the fact that Industry 4.0 is about optimizing an economic system and a commercial system that is a root cause problem of climate change and of biodiversity collapse. And if we wish to address climate change, if we wish to survive, recognizing that climate change is a human problem, the planet will be fine. The question is whether we wish to be on it. It is a human problem to work out how to reconstruct our ways of thinking, come up with a new design for life that is effectively able for 10 billion people to live sustainably and prosperously on this particular planet. And the trouble with Industry 4.0 is that it is about efficiency and optimization of productivity, of global value chains, of wealth creation, of all of the things that we have learned are fragile, are incredibly risky in terms of their extractive principles, create rampant and encourage rampant consumerism, just-in-time information, feeding senses that are really encouraging people to look for instantaneity, ask for products to be shipped all over the world, think of the possibility of buying more, forgiving waste, and failing to circuit. We have a huge opportunity to direct the power of digital technologies towards sustainability, but it requires different design principles. So this is not about not using digital technology. On the contrary, this is about really seeking to build on the power of digital technology to transform ourselves, but to provide it with the directional signals and the design principles that we need to achieve regenerative, sustainable, circular outcomes.
Thank you very much. Jean Eric, can I turn to you? What is your view? How badly do we need Industry 5.0?
Well, I think we certainly need it here and now, and I mean, Kirsten mentioned it already. The over-reliance of our industries on very short supply chains has been much impacted by the COVID pandemic. We've seen during the COVID pandemic that there are now very obvious operational and economic limits to that, and of course the war in Ukraine, the brutal invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and the atrocities happening in Ukraine add another impact on European industries. I mean, starting with energies and raw materials, but going much beyond that. We have been looking at and industry has been looking at itself, and as Europeans, we have been looking at industry as certainly a key part of Europe's social and economic model, and for very good reasons. Despite, of course, erosions in terms of competitiveness and the space which industry occupies in Europe, it remains, I think, a hallmark of how Europe is seeing itself and how we are organizing our societies and economies. And as Kirsten, I think, very eloquently put it, there is beyond the economic and supply chain challenge, existential challenge really for our industries. There's also a need for industry to transform itself deeply to ensure that it is changing its model, its functioning, its very nature really. And I think what is really encouraging is that industry, I think, very much buys into that necessity, and the, I think, added value of Industry 5.0 amongst around its many facets is that it provides indeed a new conceptual framework to revisit the way we look and act and interact with industry across all our policy areas. I mean, this is now very much a conversation in my own responsibilities on research and innovation, and we'll discuss that, no doubt. It obviously is not about research and innovation. This is really about industrial policies, about public policies about our climate and environmental policies. You mentioned the early work we did on Industry 5.0, which you did, Peter, more than a year ago. I think this also now comes with additional work within the European Commission or the European Union on a broader debate on how economic policy paradigms are progressively changing, how they need to change. And so not just narrative, but also indicators and ingredients of the narratives need to be looked at. We have just published in DG Research and Innovation in the Commission the transition index report, which provides a case, one of others. It's not one which is alone there, but that we need indeed to look at the economy and our development. I don't want to say growth, but our development beyond GDP indicators. I think the same applies to industry. We were all trained, and for good reasons, to look at industry as a key place for employment growth, and that's relevant, highly relevant. But industry is so much more, and industry needs to be so much more, and we will discuss it now in our session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kirsten spoke about the design for life and industry as a superstructure. You both said industry is already starting to work more on sustainability. Jean, can I ask you, what makes it attractive for industry, or is it something which is more a burden than an opportunity?
I think it is obviously a challenge, and transformation always has a cost, and it can be in some cases highly disruptive. I mean, there are certainly industry segments in Europe which see that green and digital transformation as an existential threat, and I don't think nobody, I think, is hiding the fact that indeed some industries either in themselves or certainly in their territorial regional distribution will certainly be much challenged in their very existence. And that is one dimension which is really key to ensure that as we see these transformations happen, and of course promote it also with our policies, this is a socially fair transition. I think that's maybe something which is really important to underline from the outset, and member states regions, but of course EU level instruments have an important responsibility to be available to ensure that this transformation indeed happens in all its disruptions by bringing workers and communities with us in that transformation, providing where the industry disruption is so existential, providing also for alternative social, economic perspectives in terms of development and activities. Having said that, it is indeed a real challenge. And I think that it's a challenge, but it's of course much more than a challenge. It's an obvious opportunity because Europe's industries, I mentioned it briefly in my first comment, are seeing historically their place in global competition and supply chains being eroded. There are a few industries which are still absolutely top world level industries and highly competitive and successful, including in areas which we don't discuss always so much as European successes. For example, the health industry and pharma industry, which is much debated, is also the European pharma industry, the one which is lifting the world out of the pandemic with the highly successful BioNTech vaccine, which is sometimes called the Pfizer vaccine. But the reality is that this is a European biotech industry product, a European science product, and also the industry. The manufacturing processes are Europe-based, and there are many, of course, other examples. But at the same time, we are much challenged in our competitiveness, and this transformation, the digital one, very traditionally also in terms of efficiencies and productivity, but it goes beyond that. But certainly, particularly the green transformation, notably on materials and energy efficiency, is the absolute key way forward to remain players, to remain relevant, to remain competitive in the future. Thanks to the ETS system, which is now, I mean, more than a decade old in Europe, our energy-intensive industries, with all their limitations, are nevertheless the most efficient one worldwide. And that is an important step, not completed yet in terms of their climate and environmental impact. They want to do more, they are asked to do more, they will do more by 2030 and beyond. And this is also how I think they will lead industrial transformation beyond Europe and will become key systemic players as we move into the future. So yes, a disruption, a real challenge, but also the way forward to remain global competitors and global actors in the next decades.
Thank you very much. Also very ambitious position, expectation towards industry. Kirsten, in the expert group, did you discuss also what makes it attractive for industry?
We did, and I think this talk has very topical timing. If you take a look at the latest report from the IPCC on the impacts of climate change, and you think about that from an industry perspective, that is a depiction of a world in which the cost of not transitioning and not transforming significantly outweighs the cost of investing in transformation now. That's a world of collapse, of chaos, of constant instability, of social instability, political collapses in security, of a rapid extension of what we're seeing now, resource collapse, conflict, tension, huge numbers of refugees. I mean, the latest figures on the expectation that we will be dealing with 170 million refugees by 2050 from climate. We're dealing with 4 so far, and we're already struggling within Europe. So I think it really from the perspective of some of our discussions was about, this is not a question of whether it's attractive. This is a question of survival, literally, a question of relevance to a world in which that is a reality that human communities are dealing with at subnational levels, at national levels, and in political blocs and in major geopolitical negotiations and discussions. But it's also an opportunity, those who move and move together and move well and in partnership with public institutions have the opportunity to structure alternative markets and structure alternative economic mechanisms and value models and measures and incentives, and therefore have the opportunity to construct their own competitiveness and coherence in that context. So our discussions were about, it's the wrong question. Flip it around. You have no choice if you wish to survive. The question is, can Europe create an enabling environment for industry in Europe and Europe's leadership in global value chains and geopolitical dynamics, for industry to have a head start and a supportive enabling set of conditions for those transformations? Then there are a few other elements which come out strongly in the paper, and they have to do with people, which is why it's so important to emphasize the human-centric nature of the 5.0 vision. I remember a couple of years ago talking with the chief strategy officer of Unilever, and he said, he was explaining, we do what we do because otherwise we would have no employees. Our issue is not shareholder capital. Our issue is employees. No one will work for an organization destroying the planet if the average age of your workforce is 25 to 30 years old. And I think there's something here about intergenerational justice around access to talent, retaining talent. One of the questions we observed was the effects of COVID, the great resignation, the choices that people are making to reevaluate. What am I doing with my life? Why am I doing it like this? What options do I have or alternatives? And the more industry steps forward with viable, attractive alternatives, where you simultaneously engage in economic activity, in employment, and in reconstructing and regenerating the planet, the more you compete. So I think there's a question here around the opportunity to address, as you referred to it, Jean Eric, industrial decline, the risks to the decline of democracy that are coming with some of that, and the ways in which industrial transformation offers competitive alternatives. Probably the number one obstacle is shareholder capitalism and shareholder capital and investor capital holding hard to expectations around above system growth, predictable returns, and a set of economic frames of reference that are incompatible with the world that the IPCC report is depicting, for example. And that, I think, is a challenge for industry. And I think the opportunity for something like the Industry 5.0 policy signal is to create a legitimizing construct to challenge that pressure and to work out what are the alternatives in public-private partnership to construct new markets, not in terms of products and services, just a diversification, but structurally different markets.
Thanks a lot, Kirsten. I'll come to the question of equality and social cohesion in a second. You mentioned also democracy now. Before that, I would like to remind everyone, if you want to make a comment, ask a question, please use Slido, EUPMH 17 Slido, and you can engage with Kirsten Dunlop and Jean Eric Paquet directly. Kirsten, you mentioned equality or inequality in the current system. It's also quite prominent in the report you have co-signed. So the twin transition, Jean-Eric mentioned, fair transition, inclusive transition, the impact of the twin transition on the ways we are living. The report says will fail if due care is not invested in maintaining social cohesion. So the question is, can Industry 5.0 really be a force for social cohesion and fight inequalities? Kirsten?
I think so. It certainly was a really central part of our discussion and about how to bake into the transformation of industry and industry leadership the combination of digital technologies, regenerative, sustainable, circular principles for design of products and services, for the design of value chains, and social sustainability. And for a couple of reasons, I think it's perfectly possible. It's technically possible, it's politically possible, it's socially possible, it's economically possible. It's a question of seeing the benefit and the necessity of doing so. And there are a number of critical reasons for that. Jean Eric referred to the Transition Performance Index. I think we are seeing more and more the limitations of the existing system, just in terms, even if it's of its effectiveness of measurement. And GDP is a particularly limited, ineffective measure now if you are really looking at complex, multi-dependent issues. We can see more and more evidence that industries and businesses that do have a higher commitment across the SDGs have high correlation with increasing investment in R&D, and that means high correlation with increasing innovation capacity, which means high correlation in terms of survivability, resilience, adaptability, and talent attraction and retention. So it's a sort of set of virtuous loops. I think there's a question here around Europe particularly has a very distinctive opportunity around questions of inclusiveness of workers, fairness, distribution, the transition justices that we need to address, to the ways in which we can think about some of the most exciting digital technologies to enable that through participatory governance, through participatory ownership, through the structuring of commons and polycentric governance around commons, long leases, ways in which we can effectively transform built environments over complex and long time frames and shared interests. And we have an opportunity of doing that, particularly in an economic context where 98% of our industry is SMEs, where they're operating in smaller scales in industrial ecosystems as family units, as part of regional specificities. There's a real richness in the way in which we think about the design of the future of work in the relationship to industrial and business design. We have a problem that wage rises are not reflecting productivity rises. It's one of the key kind of principles around the effects of digital transition that aren't translating back. But I would say the number one reflection that we were made is around resilience and the reality of a world of complex change where we cannot know the outcomes of our own circumstances and our own choices. And we see that, you see it written up in the IPCC report in the notion of maladaptation. We see it in our assumptions that electric cars will solve everything, and now we're dealing with the next wave of problems, or with SR6, the gases that we use to insulate power stations in wind farms, and suddenly realize they are way more polluting than carbon dioxide. So we know we're going to be dealing with a world where we will have to learn constantly, just in time, and have the capabilities and the mindsets to adapt constantly, just in time, to really shift our way of operating, our modus operandi, to sense, learn, respond, leverage our collective intelligence. These are human capabilities. These are intensely human, social, distributed capabilities. So Industry 5.0 is about reincorporating those capabilities into the heart of what we do with industry at all scales. And I think that's the argument. It's your core market business value generating capability, reintegrated as a core proposition, and you retain the thing we need to survive.
I saw Jean Eric wanting to come in. Jean Eric, on this cohesion question.
No, I think Kirsten set it out very, very convincingly. I would like to maybe add, repeat one element and come back and add another. The repetition is on the IPCC report. It came on the day the invasion started, or the day after, so it went by unnoticed. That there will be now a further IPCC report from the working group which deals with mitigation in the next few days, but also it will be largely overshadowed by the war in Ukraine and the brutality of the Russian invasion. We need, I think, to really in the European Commission, but also around us, colleagues, we need to ensure that these findings are made available and are repeated. Whichever meeting I have attended in my last 5 or 10 years, when we started a meeting with the context being put forward again on where we stand on biodiversity erosion, climate change, the quality of the meeting thereafter was of a totally different nature. The fact is, we know what these reports say. It's in our background, but we don't act on them. And therefore, I think they serve as a purpose also as an absolute essential reminder. And the more they are put to the forefront, and I'm sorry to be repeating it once more and again, the more we will act on them. So please, colleagues, look them up. There are very good policy summaries in them now. It's really very, very good pieces also of policy communication, which are produced by these amazing teams of scientists, supported by policymakers. Let's make the best use of them. Now, indeed, the human dimension is absolutely essential, and I think it has two aspects. It's of course firstly the workforce, and here I think Kirsten said it essentially all. I would maybe just emphasize again the digital skills, which are going to be absolutely critical. It's more than the digital skills. The adaptability is probably even more important, and I think it is. I'm not sure I can entirely see from here that education and lifelong learning and industry will be able across this very, very large workforce to really transform transform the skill sets fast enough. But we need to try. We really need to try, not just with a few companies which are well equipped for that, but across the core of Europe's industry, and indeed these very many SMEs, which are the fabric of our societies and our industry capacities. It's a real top level challenge for all actors. So the digital transformation and this capacity of adaptability and resilience. But the other dimension of this human-centric industry 5.0 is also the society within which these industries act. And I mean, Kirsten mentioned lifestyles, for example, or not for example, centrally lifestyles, which are very much driven by also our industries and their marketing, in their vision to an extent as well, and in pushing products into consumption. And I think here society needs to engage with industry, and I think it's a positive engagement which the Industry 5.0 promotes, which I very, very much welcome. And it goes both ways, with society needing to be demanding on industry, and in particular on the impact of industry on lifestyles and consumerism. But conversely, I think the industry also needs society to make industrial choices. I'm very concerned myself with the limitation of the uptake of research and innovation outcomes in society. And I'm very much promoting the idea that industry needs to make technological, maybe at the outset, scientific choices together with industry to make, on the one hand, better choices, but also choices which today might create concerns into society, maybe pushback, but which I think would be much more acceptable if they were decided with society. And I'm thinking here, as you know, Peter, of plant gene editing, where I think we are getting it wrong personally, in the sense that plant gene editing is, of course, technologically not genetic. It's not GMOs. It's a different setup with therefore also different consequences in terms of nature impact. But that is already too scientific and too technical, including for myself, to be very honest. But I think what is also interesting about plant gene editing is that the applications could be particularly relevant in the transformations we are discussing. It is two things, to develop a plant which is specified to use certain fertilizers or weed killers, which is how we look at GMOs usually, and no names put forward here by myself, I don't need to. Another thing is to develop a plant with hydric stress features, which would allow it to be relevant in terms of agriculture, less intensive agriculture, in the dry conditions which we will know, including in Europe, but of course across the globe. And if that conversation could be had with society, I think these technologies, notably in Europe, would be much easier to deploy in agriculture in this example. So the human-centric nature of Industry 5.0 looks a little bit like the soft dimension of the concept. It's on the contrary at the heart of it, and particularly important.
Thank you so much. I cannot help but coming back to the IPCC report you both mentioned, and Jean Eric, one of these 5 system changes pointed to in this report is industry, the other is urban infrastructure, ocean ecosystems. There is a direct match with what you are doing with EU missions. Can we briefly go into the link between missions, transition, Industry 5.0? Would you like to start, Jean Eric?
Don't start me on the missions, but yes, I'd be happy to say a few words on the European missions, which were kicked off by the Commission in September. There was a lot of work before that September 21 kickoff with mission boards, which were extremely active in the last 2 years. They are anchored in Horizon Europe, and these 5 European missions, they are about making a change in society. We are hoping to find, and we are in fact finding 100 European cities which will declare their ambition to be climate neutral, not by 2050, but by 2030. So an extraordinarily ambitious objective time-wise, also content-wise, but time-wise. We are selecting them as we speak. One mission on cleaning up our water systems, but our oceans particularly. One mission on restoring the quality of our soils, a key component both of environmental and climate policies. One mission on helping regions to invest in their climate adaptability, in their resilience to climate change. Mitigation remains at the heart of climate policy, but adaptation is of course now necessary everywhere in the world and in Europe also. And then a mission on cancer to reduce the toll cancer takes on societies. Well, the missions are interesting in many aspects, but for our conversation now, I would highlight 2 in particular. The first one is that they try to combine EU-level instruments, our toolbox, regulation, investment, and of course, research solutions to be deployed, with what is happening at local and national level, very much at local level. To ensure that the policies, the European and national, let's say the public policies across Europe, deliver in society. So this is really delivery focused. That's really one of the specificities of the missions. It's not the first time, obviously, that at EU level we are so much focusing on not just providing frameworks and instruments, but on working across European levels of governance to ensure delivery in society, but we're really trying to bring it to the next level, including by deploying knowledge and solutions from research and innovation. And the second dimension of the missions, which is relevant, is that they are citizens-based. The idea is not that that policymakers, mayors, regional governors or administrations, our counterparts in national administrations ourselves, we deal with the missions obviously, but we want to design the implementation with citizens. And that is because the transformations and the delivery we are aiming at requires indeed public policies, regulatory signals, investments, and solutions which need public policy level resources. But in reality, this is about transforming deeply the way we live. And therefore, the ownership of citizens is going to be absolutely essential. And to get that ownership, the design of the mission implementation needs to be done jointly. And so we are effectively across the 5 missions working with citizens to design the plans for the mission. So I think that connects really well with Industry 5.0, all the more so that in all of the missions, industry is to an extent part of the challenge or the problem, and very much in all cases part of the solution.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Eric. Kirsten, would you like to comment on this link, Industry 5.0 and EU missions?
Yes, so I'm going to comment on this from the perspective of an organization that is kind of on the ground, starting the implementation actually with the mission on cities, with the Net Zero City pilot. And I think I would absolutely echo and endorse and reinforce the message that industry is an essential driver, component, contributor, enabler of the mission, the vision for missions. I think, and for me, from the perspective of being on the ground and dealing, for example, with cities who are taking a huge leap of faith to commit and sign up to decarbonizing as a whole city by 2030 or as really large districts. The mission is essentially about making a leap between what is needed and what we currently believe or know to be possible. And that leap is why I'm describing it as a leap of faith. It is into the pure unknown. We do not know how to decarbonize that scale of cities by 2030, but yet we need to. And I think the challenge is, and the invitation almost I would have back into this conversation, is we desperately need industry involved. At the moment, because of the way in which we have a number of things structured, when industry players come to the table, they get entangled in a set of expectations or perceptions about having vested interests, about particular stakes, about whether they can or when they can meaningfully engage. And I speak very much as part of an organization that is a community of multiple organizations, including industry, often stuck on, well, how do we participate? And I think this actually goes to the heart of one of the things that is mentioned in the Industry 5.0 paper. We need to restructure the way we're doing research and innovation, and the enablement of work like missions that gets option space, it gets a different way of different actors in our industrial system able to contribute to innovations that are deployed before necessarily assuming that these are simply the answers that will scale up into markets. It's harnessing innovation as a learning environment, which means harnessing and opening the doors to the way in which we get industrial cross-collaboration with citizens, with employees and consumers, and voters, and with public administration. And that is a really significant need and an opportunity space for the missions to try and bring to life. But we need to go into it eyes wide open, because it will not happen automatically.
Can I just add, Peter, before you come with your next question, that we had, as Kirsten knows, we had this call for cities to see how many would want to be part of this mission, and we had more than 350 applications, so way more than we expected. Of course, not all these cities will be supported under the mission, but I very much hope that the 100 cities which will get going will indeed then also inspire, and we will ensure that what we learn with these 100 cities is available way beyond that group, including to these 350, but certainly also very many other cities across Europe. These 350 cities represent 20% of the EU population. So, I mean, I'm saying this just to illustrate that this mission can make a really spectacular difference in us getting to the 2030 targets and working faster towards full climate neutrality.
Thank you. I hear you loud and clear, and I think this is also something we can take up in the follow-up now to answer Kirsten's question: how can industry engage and to broaden up these bridges? I still have two questions before we go to the questions here from you, the audience, which are quite good and challenging, so something to look forward to. But my next question is about governance. How can we do it in terms of authorizations and governance? And the ESIR report, Kirsten, introduces this concept of governance 5.0. It notes that Industry 5.0 puts radically new demands on government, on public policy, and the interaction industry and state. So can you say a bit more what governance 5.0 means and how we get there?
Absolutely. So I was referring to the fact that Industry 5.0 is about creating the directional signal and a vision for a new design for human life, human economy. This is not something that will emerge through the natural, unnatural, left to their own devices dynamics of market forces as we currently have them structured, or certainly will not emerge in time. Or the cost of waiting and the cost of allowing sufficient crisis to really wash through and catalyze change, I think, is too great a price to pay. So this and the paper really strongly frames this is about a deep partnership between public and private actors, which is not just a question of acting in time and not just a question of intervention in terms of regulation and policy. It's also a question of the underlying principle at stake, which is about governance of the commons and about working in a different way in relationship to resources, to distribution, to fairness, social justice, but also intergenerational justice. So it's not just a question of in the moment, it's also a question of over time. So the paper does very strongly argue for government 5.0. If you're going to do Industry 5.0, you need government 5.0. And that's referring to a couple of things. It's referring to the fact that on the public side of things, in government, in public administrations, if you're going to ask industry to show up and to invest in distributed capability, in agility, in adaptability, in governance mindsets that take into perspective multiple needs and balance them off and design for distribution of wealth and outcome that is no longer single-handedly directed to shareholders, if you're shifting from shareholder to stakeholder through that towards a kind of European enterprise vision, as we've been discussing, then you need a partner capable of acting and thinking in the same terms, capable of coming to the table with a similar degree of flexibility, with a similar degree of agility, capable of understanding that complexity means we cannot set on kind of 20-year frames and say, that's it, set and forget, that'll be fine. You're going to need to be changing it constantly. We need research and innovation frameworks that comprehend the fact that we don't know which of the 100 solutions we will deploy in cities will really work for those contexts. So we have to deploy many of them together, test and learn, and adapt our policy and our incentives and our capital and our measures to that. That requires just a completely different set of mindsets. So our recommendation is that there needs to be, in the same breath that you ask for one thing from industry in Europe, we need to ask of the public policy and of the governance side and government side a similar degree of change, structural change. And that also requires investment in training, in mindsets, in rules, in tools, in practices, in thinking about labor relations and so on. So it's about working together in new ways. It's about new capabilities to partner. It's about accepting and embracing the principle of public-private partnership as a feature, not as a bug, as an absolute structural feature of what it is that we are seeking to achieve. And it is about understanding that that's actually got what is likely to give Europe its greatest competitive advantage. We are capable of creating global standards, and we are capable of creating them in an adaptable and agile way so that they don't become behemoths, they become genuinely enabling environments. But we did want to call out that this is not just, it takes two to tango. This is about government. It's about public policy, it's about skills and capabilities, about institutions, but it's also about corporate governance and the institutions that govern corporate life and the institutions that set rules on a global or a European or a national or subnational scale for organizations and industries. And some of those rule-making institutions could be called in to actively contribute in terms of KPIs, measures, incentives, and encourage and kind of enabling frameworks. And we called in, for example, something like the equivalent of what happened in the financial crisis with the Financial Stability Board, setting a kind of a clear signal that financial institutions that were too systemically important to fail had to meet different standards around solvency and systemic thinking and corporate governance responsibility. And I think we have an opportunity here to transact around that, to create a signal around value chains and industrial players who are too systemically important for our survival not to transform. But then that partnership needs to be fully supported by public policy, public administration, and government.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Jean, would you like to come in on this point on governance, collective intelligence?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that. And maybe also, I haven't seen all the questions in the chat box, but I saw a few as they were coming in, and maybe try to react as I complement now to one at least of them, which is, I mean, the first thing I think I would say is that at EU level, many of these public policy contributions, public policy frameworks, regulatory signals are being provided. I mean, all of them can be discussed. I don't think I would here want to claim that they are all perfect. And I know that there has been a very controversial discussion around sustainable financing in particular, with the discussion on the inclusion of gas, which is now looked at probably rather differently, but okay, and of nuclear. But so without going into that controversy, and many other of the framework policies which we are putting in place out of the Green Deal, I think really serve the purpose, Kirsten, which you have now very well described, and with which I agree 100%. And I think maybe here just to say that indeed the Green Deal is in the European Commission, increasingly across EU institutions, but certainly in the EU Commission, the cardinal point or the compass of other public policies, and that is of course not so easy to, or not so immediate to transform itself into hard realities across all public policies, but it's happening. It's really happening, and I think the first 2.5 3 years of this Commission are an absolute game changer. And what I think is pretty spectacular, if you allow me this moment of complacency, is that this is happening within and despite of the crisis. We have not changed the direction at all. So I think that is encouraging. Now the question is whether this is enough to be fast enough. That was a good point you make, Kirsten. And I'm personally, and each IPCC report confirms again that it's not fast enough. To an extent, the urgency of the transformations, notably of the energy systems, is going to now be even greater out of the Ukraine war. So let's see where this gets us in the next few weeks and years. But I think the urgency is really what is important, and what I would recommend that as Commission or EU officials here in this meeting, and as actors interested, we focus on criticizing components and trying to improve them, but also focus then on the take-up of what is available, so that the urgent need for action translated at national and actors level really happens. That's really, I think, now the challenge. The second brief point I would make, Peter, is indeed that one dimension of the governance, and this is here both private and public entities, is indeed this notion of systemic approaches, holistic approaches, whole of government approaches, which I think is very obvious to scientists and research policy actors. And it's also, I think, quite obvious within the European Commission as a collegial institution. We have, in the last phase, again, out of the Green Deal, amongst others, also in the governance of Horizon Europe, to take one example close to me, we have really, I think, moved up the capacity to effectively integrate, not just talk to each other, but effectively create and build policies across the organization, with indeed then this collective intelligence of the institution being more visible and producing more impactful initiatives, which hopefully can then meet the acid test of urgency.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I was just going to build on that. I can think of a couple of examples to Jean Eric's point where you can see this already happening. And I think there's a real opportunity here to join up different parts of European policy to enable this. So, for example, in Sweden, you do have something like, you do have the fossil-free Sweden initiative that is a direct partnership between industry and government to work on 22 industries. And it's setting a precedent for how do you really braid it together. You have institutions like the OECD with a unit on anticipatory governance working with European regional governments or provincial governments, as is happening in the Basque region, where there's a training of public administration capability in anticipatory governance and translating that into practice on the ground. So there are good examples of where this is happening. We've just signed up to the European Pact on Skills. I would love to see that the Skills Pact actively sought to build the kind of systems thinking mindsets, not as a soft side that's kind of nice to have, but as you said, with the people dimension in Industry 5.0, Jean Eric, as the absolute core of what we need. There's a kind of basic skill set across the board, and then that gets us started.
Thank you both. I realize our time flies actually, and we need to slowly come to the end. Let's zoom in on research and innovation, Jean. The ambition is so high here, and you both said, okay, it's already starting on governance, on industry moving. So how do you see the role of research and innovation to accompany, accelerate this transition process towards Industry 5.0?
So I think, firstly, research and innovation provides knowledge. It fed into the Industry 5.0, and there's of course a feedback loop. So we need to use it also to think about our research architecture. Then research provides indeed solutions. I mean, technological ones, this is obvious, but also platforms for social innovation. The missions are one example of that. There are others. And but where I think European research is still in need of real upgrade is twofold. Firstly, we need around the European research area, we also are now working on an innovation policy paper. We need to ensure that we really get to critical mass with member states on the one hand, but also with industry on the other hand. We have historically had powerful partnerships which have really made, in many cases, quite a difference. And I think the SMIRE partnership, for example, which is now followed up on the Horizon Europe, it's made for, is it made for Europe, the follow-up? No, it's
Process for Planet.
Process for Planet. Thank you, Peter.
It's made in Europe, Jean Eric, both.
Are two examples of partnerships. We need much more of that. So that's one dimension on which I think we need to be you need to be demanding on research policymakers. The other one, and this is progressively happening, and this comes back a little bit to the governance discussion, and is at the heart of Industry 5.0, is to ensure that you have continuum from knowledge creation through science to technological development, including demonstrations through research policies and innovation policies, into deployment. Back to the urgency and to the need to really team up. And I see more and more efforts done by colleagues in the institution to connect the alliances with the partnerships. That's, I think, really a great avenue to ensure that deployment happens fast. We are working under the missions to do that in these 5 areas, and there are many other examples. And I would really wish that in the Commission, as we are preparing our investment policies, we connect them back. I mean, where relevant. It's not always necessary. There are also investments which are straightforward, but many investments are really benefiting much by being connected to applied research, because that also then gives a strong sense of direction for deployment and investment policies which are future proof, or at least future proof as far as we know the future. As Kirsten quite well said at the beginning, we need a degree of humility there, but at least future proof to 2030, and that is really essential. So critical mass and connection between research and implementation in society are really the way to go, and we can do even more and better.
Thank you very much. You have already in your different answers covered some of the questions, but let me go to some which I think we have not yet fully covered. And there's one to you directly, Kirsten, on how might a structurally different market look like?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I would be doing a lot and much faster. I think there are some elements that we see. Some of them are actually some of the design principles that are in the Industry 5.0 paper. So, for example, redundancy, deliberate chosen redundancy, because we know that it is significantly more resilient. So that's modular, self-sustaining, decentralized mechanisms that then need market structures that are part owned or participatory, or at least shared, have shared stakes. We know that something around changing our notion around time. We are living in a world where we have collapsed time to zero as our ultimate economic value. So instantaneity of transactions, of exchanges, has become the competitive edge. And yet we know that indigenous societies took decisions with 17 or 7-year timeframes. There are structural differences in the way in which we require governance and market decisions to think about time. We have major transitions to do in the built environment, in agriculture, in land use and landscape that will require that, or consequences in terms of the way in which we indeed apply technologies through that will require that. I think there are questions around the way we think about value. We currently have an economic structure think about discounted accounting. We systematically discount the future in favor of the present and present value. This partly goes to time frames, but it also goes to our question of understanding the relationship between future value and, for example, the preservation of resources, of biodiversity, of land, of the balance of kind of room to live with our present needs. So beginning to kind of work out what is it that we would need to construct and understand as value, work that back into a set of exchanges and rules and values that translate into governance responsibilities or liabilities, carrot and stick, incentives, or translate into mechanisms for measurement. And this is where digital technology starts to hugely come into play. If we think about something like multi-agent virtual AI, able to cope or be coded for regeneration and carbon capture, and then how do you translate that back into a set of distributed market values that you're deliberately incentivized to trade for, trade with? So I don't have all of the answers to that. It's probably one of the areas where we are working fastest and deepest. The opportunity to work with 100 cities simultaneously, and for those who lead the adaptation mission, 100 regions simultaneously, that creates scale and dynamics around demand finance or demand, the economics of demand, that gives us opportunities to design differently around the inputs into that, the release of that demand, the notion of common good and commons, and polycentric governance. And if you put economic thinking and polycentric governance together, we start to get some new ideas. So I know there's a lot, there's European experiments around the universal basic income, around the well-being economy. There are many, many elements we can start to put together. I think our number one opportunity here is to create an environment in which we can experiment with that, and not as minor experiments, large-scale demonstrations, the language that Jean Eric was using, because we know that the cost of inaction will outweigh the cost of acting. So we have some investment to place.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Very much to my regret, we need to come to an end now. Before I give you both the word for a closing statement, I wanted to thank you for very insightful discussion, exchange here, very rich. Also, you who have posed questions here, they're all very well noted and are encouraging us also in the next steps. So thank you for that. I hear both Jean Eric and Kirsten setting the level of ambition very high, recognizing the power of industry as part of the problem, but much bigger part of the solution. Being very clear and outspoken about the challenges ahead, the things we've got wrong so far in previous models, the need to come to a new design for our life, which enables or involves every one of us, also us as citizens and society, the authorities. We spoke about governance. So, the link with not just research and innovation, not just EU missions, any type of policy, industrial policy, employment policy, education policy, competition and corporate law policy you touched upon. So a broad area which you covered here, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of not only us and my team here, but those who listen to you. Heartfelt thanks to both of you for this discussion. And now perhaps in one word or sentence, back to you, Jean Eric.
Peter and Kirsten, apologies, I will start because I am already in principle in a meeting with member states on Ukraine. So I leave now. Peter, thank you and colleagues in this meeting. The effort around Industry 5.0, Europe's transformation against the context which we described during the meeting is your responsibility, and it's your opportunity, and it's going to be your ambition and your achievements. We need to do that collectively, and therefore very grateful to colleagues in the SecGen and to you, Peter, for setting this up. And Kirsten, it was great listening to you. I am impressed as always. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you. Good luck.
Kirsten.
Peter, I think I would thank you. I think I would just reflect. I was just looking at first, I would like to compliment the fantastic questions there. Really got me thinking around all sorts of possibilities. I think I would really reflect to land this back in around what you described as the ambition for research and innovation, its role within Europe, and the way in which it amplifies and enables. My principal reflection would be that we have a superpower as a species, and that is our capacity to learn. our capacity to learn, to create, to invent, to sense, to experience, and to rapidly convert that experience into ingenuity, to creativity, and to learning and adaptability. Innovation is the ultimate expression of that. It is the tool we use to do that. I think if we can embrace the idea that we need research and innovation policy frameworks and funding frameworks and incentives and measures, and indeed I notice in the chat KPIs, that are designed so that they are fit for that purpose, not for the purpose of producing linear answers to a world that's stable. We are not in a world that's stable, but for the purpose of learning fast and adapting fast and building on the enormous wealth of intelligence, including from the release of energy from migration and crisis. Then we have superpowers harnessed to the possibility of regeneration and of prosperity in a way that rebuilds trust and well-being. We need it. I think we have the possibility, and here we are enormously privileged to have so many ingredients to do that well.
Kirsten, I don't know how to thank you. This was a poetic closing on superpowers, innovation, and a big encouragement to all of us here and all future listeners. Thank you all. Best wishes. Bye-bye.
Thank you.